The first thing my husband said after 7 years of silence was my name. Not hello. Not where am I, not how long has it been. My name, 2 syllables. The way he had always said them, with a slight emphasis on the second. The way a person says the name of someone they have been thinking about for a very long time. My name is Dorothy Ellison. I am 63 years old. I live in a small house in Maplewood, Tennessee, and I have a vegetable garden in the back that gets too much sun in July, but that I tend anyway because the tending is the point, not the perfection of the outcome. My husband James is 67. He is not in the garden yet. He is still learning to walk again, which is slower than either of us expected, but faster than the doctors said was possible. And we are both in the habit of exceeding what the doctors say is possible. We have been married for 38 years. We were married when James was 29 and I was 25, and we were very young, and we did not know then what we know now about what a marriage actually requires of 2 people over the length of a life. You cannot know that at 25. You can only learn it, year by year, with the person you chose. I want to tell you the whole story. Not just the 7 years and not just the final morning when James said my name for the first time since the accident. The whole story, because the whole story is the only one that makes sense of any of it. James Ellison grew up in Maplewood. His father ran a hardware store on the main street that later became the building where the insurance company is now. His mother taught 4th grade for 30 years. He was the only child of people who had wanted more children and had not been given them, which produced in James a particular quality of being loved completely and singularly that I noticed the first time I met him, and that I have been grateful for ever since. He took over his father's store when his father's health declined, and he ran it for 8 years before the big hardware chain came to the county and made the small independent store impossible, and he had to close it. That closing was one of the harder things in our life together. James was not built for failure in the way that some people are built for it, with a resilience that processes loss quickly and moves on. He was built to stay. The store was his father's store and his grandfather's store before that, and the closing required a long grief that he went through privately, and that I tried to help him carry without taking it from him because it was his to carry. He went back to school at 42. He got a degree in mechanical engineering, which had always interested him, and he found work with a firm in Nashville that was close enough to drive and far enough to feel like a different world. He was good at the work. He had always been good at things that required understanding how pieces fit together. We could not have children. We found out early in the marriage, and we went through the process of understanding what that meant for us and what we wanted to do about it. The grief of it was real, and it took time, and we did not rush it. After the grief, we talked about adoption. Not immediately. It took 2 more years before we were ready to talk about it clearly. We went through the process, and in the spring, when James was 45 and I was 41, a boy named Marcus came to live with us. Marcus was 7 years old. He had dark eyes and a serious way of looking at things that reminded me of James, and that I later understood was just the particular gravity of a child who has learned that adults cannot always be trusted to stay. We were very aware of this and very careful with it. We made certain things certain. The room was his room. The house was his home. We were not filling in for parents who might return. We were his parents. He was a good boy. I do not say that in the way people say it about children who are easy. I say it in the way that is true. Marcus was honest in the way that comes from a child who has decided that honesty is the safest policy after years of being surprised by dishonesty. He worked hard in school because he understood that school was the path and he was going to walk it. He was kind to animals and patient with old people, and he made James laugh in a way that I had not seen James laugh since his father was alive. We were a family. 3 people in a house in Maplewood, making a life together. James fixed things on weekends, and I grew things in the garden, and Marcus played in the yard, and grew up slowly the way children do when they are in a safe place. He grew up. That is the part that seems obvious, and is not. Marcus grew up and became a young man, and a young man has a world outside the house that the parents only partially see. He met a girl named Lacey when he was 20, and she was 22, and she was the first person outside our family that he had talked about with anything approaching enthusiasm. I want to be fair to Lacey because fair is what I committed to a long time ago. She was attractive and smart, and she had a way of making Marcus feel like the most important person in any room she was in. I understood the appeal. I had been made to feel like the most important person in a room before, by James, and I knew what that felt like, and I knew why a young man would mistake that feeling for everything. I had concerns. I will say that plainly. From the first dinner where Lacey sat at our kitchen table and talked and listened and smiled, I had a feeling in my chest that was not quite what I would call dislike. It was more like an awareness, the awareness of someone who has been paying attention for a long time, recognizing a pattern in the way another person pays attention. She paid attention to everything, specifically to the things that mattered, the house and what it was worth. The degree to which James and I had done well over the years, the question of what Marcus stood to inherit, which came up once in a conversation with Marcus alone, which Marcus mentioned to me later without understanding why I received it. With the particular stillness that I did, I put my concern away. Marcus was happy. My concern was not proof of anything. I had been wrong about people before. James's accident happened in March. He was 59 years old. He had been with the engineering firm for 14 years, and he was driving home from a site visit on a wet road in the early evening when a truck crossed the center line. The skull fracture was on the right side. The brain injury was what they called traumatic and what I called devastating. Though devastation is a word that does not fully account for what it means to sit in a hospital waiting room at 10 in the evening and have a doctor say the word severe to you, in that specific tone that prepares you for more words you did not want to hear, he survived. That was the first thing. Then the second thing was that surviving was not the same as recovering, and that recovery in this case was a word that would need to be redefined to mean something different from what it had meant before. James could not speak, he could not walk. He had periods of consciousness, and periods of something that was not quite unconsciousness, but was not what any of us would have called present. He recognized me sometimes. His eyes would find mine in the room, and something would happen in them that was recognition, and I held on to that something, with both hands through every day of the 7 years that followed. The rehabilitation center told me what was possible and what was not. I listened carefully, I did not argue. I took their information and I put it with the other information I had, which included 38 years of knowing James Ellison, and I made my own assessment. My assessment was that James was in there, that the person I had known for 38 years was present inside whatever the injury had left, and that presence required attending to, every day, with the specific patience of someone who is not in a hurry and who understands that some things grow slowly. I attended to it. Marcus came to the hospital the night of the accident and did not leave until morning. That is who he was. When something happened to his family, he came and he stayed. He took time off work in the first weeks, and he sat with James, and he talked to him the way you talk to someone you are not sure can hear you, but you talk anyway because the alternative is silence, and silence is a kind of giving up. Lacey came once in the first month. She sat for about an hour, and she was appropriate and sympathetic, and she left when she said she had to leave, and she did not come back again for several weeks. I noticed, I put it with the other things I had noticed, and I went back to attending to James. The physical therapist at the rehabilitation center was a woman named Patricia, who had been working with brain injury patients for 20 years. She was direct about what she saw and what she expected, and she did not pretend that she knew things she did not know. She told me that sensory stimulation was one of the approaches being explored. She said the research suggested that consistent sensory input to the extremities could, in some cases, support neural pathway development. She said the fingers and the toes were particularly relevant because the sensory nerve endings there were dense, and the pathways to the brain were well established. She showed me specific exercises, pressure and texture and temperature. I learned them all. I went home and I practiced them on myself to understand what they felt like from the inside, and then I went back to James and I practiced them on him. I did this every day. Twice a day in the rehabilitation center, and then when he came home to our house with the medical equipment and the hospital bed in the living room, every day at home. Something happened one afternoon in the 3rd month. I was working on his feet, his left foot specifically, which the therapists had focused on because the right side of the brain injury affected the left side of the body. I was doing the pressure exercises, and I was not thinking about anything except the exercise, and I tried something on impulse. I brought his toe to my mouth and I bit it. Not hard. The firm pressure of teeth and the warmth of breath, James's foot moved. Not involuntarily, reflexively, but also not nothing. The movement had a quality of response rather than reflex, and I sat with that distinction for a moment, and then I did it again, and the foot moved again, and I said, "James, did you feel that?" And his eyes found mine, and the something was there. I did it every day after that, every morning. His toes, his fingers, the arches of his feet, the palms of his hands. Firm pressure and warmth. Bite and hold and release and watch. It felt strange at first, and then it became routine, the way all things become routine when you do them every day with intention. The therapists were skeptical. Patricia was not dismissive, but she was careful about expectations. She said the movement I was describing could be consistent with neural pathway engagement, or it could be reflex. She said to keep documenting what I observed. I documented what I observed every day in a notebook that I still have. Marcus came on weekends. He sat with his father and he talked, and sometimes he helped with the exercises, and sometimes he just sat. He was going through something of his own in those months, but he showed up anyway. That is who Marcus had always been. The showing up was not contingent on his own situation being easy. Lacey did not come to the house. She called sometimes. She asked how James was doing, and she asked how Marcus was doing, and the questions were appropriate, and the tone was appropriate, and I answered them appropriately, and I noticed the not coming. Marcus told me in the 6th month that Lacey had been asking about the estate. Not for herself, he said. She was just thinking about the future, he said. She thought it would be important for them, for Marcus and her, to understand the situation so they could plan. I said I was sure she had his best interests at heart. I said it pleasantly. I had become very good at saying things pleasantly. I need to tell you about the money because the money is part of the story, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. James and I had built a modest but solid financial situation over 38 years. The house was paid off. There were savings and some investments and a life insurance policy that James had taken out when Marcus came to live with us. James had also, in the years of his work with the engineering firm, accumulated some equity in the firm itself that had become, by the time of the accident, more significant than either of us had fully accounted for. The will was standard. Whatever we had went to the other and then to Marcus. There was nothing complicated about it. Lacey knew this. Marcus had told her, or she had found out some other way. Either was possible. In the 2nd year, after the accident, Lacey started talking to Marcus about a prenuptial agreement. Not for herself, she said, for clarity. She said that in the event of their marriage, they should have everything clearly documented so that there were no misunderstandings. Marcus told me about this conversation in a way that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with it, but was not sure what to do with the discomfort. I said a prenuptial agreement was a reasonable thing to discuss when two people were considering marriage, and that the specifics mattered, and that he should make sure he understood exactly what he was agreeing to before he agreed. He nodded. He said he would. He trusted me. He had always trusted me, and I was aware of what that trust required of me in return. In the 3rd year, Lacey presented Marcus with a proposed agreement. She said she had had an attorney review it. The attorney had reviewed it on her behalf, which was not the same as on his behalf, which Marcus did not fully understand until I pointed it out. I said, Marcus, this document needs to be reviewed by your attorney, not her attorney, yours. He said he thought it was straightforward. I said I was sure it was, and that an attorney would be able to confirm that quickly. He looked at me for a moment, and I looked back and I did not say anything else, and eventually he said, all right. His attorney found 3 things in the document that were not straightforward. One of them involved the disposition of inherited assets in the event of death or incapacity. It was written in a way that, under certain circumstances, would have directed Marcus's portion of James's estate in a direction that was not Marcus. I did not say I told you so. I did not need to. The conversation between Marcus and Lacey that followed the attorney review was one that I was not present for, but that Marcus told me about afterward. He said Lacey had an explanation for each of the 3 things the attorney had identified. She said the attorney she had used was very conservative, and that the language was standard. She said Marcus was overthinking it. She said it was important to her that they had something in writing before they got married, and that his hesitation was hurting her. Marcus told me he had felt guilty when she said that. He said she had a way of presenting her own needs that made his concerns feel like evidence of a failure to love her properly. He said he had been trying to address that feeling for a long time. I said, that is an important thing to notice about someone. He said he knew. He said he was still figuring out what to do with it. I said, take your time. I said there was no hurry. I said the decisions you make about who you share your life with are the most important decisions you will ever make, and they deserve all the time they need. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, do you think I made a mistake? I said, I think you are a very good man who deserves to be loved completely, and I want you to make sure you are finding that. He was quiet for a while, then he said, I am going to think about some things. He thought about some things. The thinking took about 6 months. At the end of the 6 months, he came to tell me that he and Lacey had ended the relationship. He did not say much about it. He sat at the kitchen table in the house where he had grown up, and he drank the coffee I made, and he looked out the window at the garden, and he said, "I think I knew for a long time." I said, "Yes." I said, "I thought so too." He said, "Why didn't you say something?" I said, "Because it was yours to know." I said I could see it, but seeing it for you would not have helped you. He had to see it himself, and he had. He nodded. Then he asked about his father, and we talked about James, and about the exercises, and about what I had been noticing. The 7th year was different from the others. I cannot explain it precisely. It was not a single change. It was a quality of accumulation. The exercises had been happening for 7 years, and the notebooks were full, and the therapists had revised their assessments several times in ways that moved from skeptical to cautious, to something that one of them called genuinely remarkable, and that I called consistent. James was in there. I had known that from the beginning. The evidence of it had been accumulating for 7 years, in the notebooks and in the exercises and in the moments where his eyes found mine, and the something was present. The something was becoming more. The something was growing. Slowly, the way things grow when they are tended every day with the specific patience of someone who is not in a hurry. In April of the 7th year, he squeezed my hand, not reflex, not the involuntary movements that had been documented and categorized. He squeezed my hand when I held it, and I said, "James, squeeze my hand if you can hear me," and he squeezed. I sat there for a long time after that. I held his hand and I breathed. Patricia came the next morning and I told her. She tested it herself, and he squeezed again, and she sat back in her chair, and she looked at me with an expression that I had not seen from her in 7 years, and that I understood as the expression of a person revising something they had believed. She said, "Keep doing what you are doing." I said I intended to. In June he moved his arm toward me when I came into the room. In August he tracked me with his eyes when I moved across the room, not just finding me when I was still, but following me. In September he made a sound, not a word. A sound, low and deliberate. When I came in one morning, and I stopped in the doorway, and I said, "James, was that you?" And he made the sound again. I sat down next to him. I took his hand. I said, "James, I am here." I said, "I have been here." I said, "Take whatever time you need." He took 2 more months. On a Tuesday morning in November, I came into the room where James had been sleeping, and I did the exercises the way I had done them every day for 7 years. And I talked to him the way I had talked to him every day for 7 years. I told him about the garden. I told him the tomatoes had been good this summer. I told him Marcus was coming for Thanksgiving, and that I was making the sweet potato casserole he liked. I told him it had rained overnight, and the air smelled like it, and the leaves were almost finished turning. I was holding his hand. I was not looking at his face. I was looking out the window at the garden, the way I looked at it every morning. He said my name. I turned. He was looking at me. His eyes were clear in a way they had not been. Not the recognition I had been holding on to for 7 years. The something that told me he was in there. This was more than that. This was James, fully present. Looking at me across the room we had shared for 38 years. He said my name again, slower. The way he always said it, with the emphasis on the second syllable. I said James. He said I know. He said it took too long. He said his voice sounded like something that had not been used in a very long time, and he was right about that. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I am now." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Dorothy." He said, "I love you." I said, "I know." I said, "I have always known." That was 8 months ago. James has been in rehabilitation since November, the intensive kind. The kind that his doctors call exceptional progress, and that I call James being exactly who he has always been, which is a man who does not give up on things. He can walk with assistance. He is working on without. He can speak in full sentences, slowly, with effort, and the effort is worth it every time. Marcus was at Thanksgiving. He helped James into his chair at the table, and he sat next to him, and they talked slowly. In the particular way of 2 people who have things to say to each other, and who are in no hurry to rush the saying of them. After dinner, James asked to be brought to the window. He looked out at the garden in the November dark. He sat for a long time. Then, he said, "Dorothy, what happened to that thing you planted along the back fence?" I said the climbing rose. I said it's still there. I said it bloomed this summer. He said good. He said he had been thinking about that rose. I said, "What else have you been thinking about?" He said everything. He said he had had a lot of time to think. He said some things he understood better now. He said some things he wanted to say to Marcus. He said he was glad I had kept the garden going. I said the garden is not hard to keep going if you tend it. He said, "I know." He said that was what he had been thinking about, that you just have to tend things. He said you did not stop tending things. I said no, I said I did not. He put his hand over mine the way he had always put his hand over mine, with the specific warmth of a man who means the gesture completely, and we sat at the window and looked at the garden in the dark. About the estate, people ask me about it sometimes. People who have heard the story, they ask whether there were problems, whether Lacey had done anything that could not be undone. Whether the situation James came back to was complicated. The situation James came back to was not complicated. James came back to the house he had left, and to the garden his wife had kept going, and to a son who had found his way through a difficult season and come out the other side. He came back to everything that was actually his, which was exactly as it should be. The prenuptial agreement that Lacey had proposed was never signed. The relationship that had been the context for that agreement had ended 3 years before James opened his eyes. Marcus had spent those 3 years working and saving and building something that was his own, and that he did not share with anyone who did not deserve to share it. James has been told the outline of what happened. We have talked about it, the way two people talk about the years they spent apart, carefully, with the acknowledgement that there is more to tell and that there is time to tell it. He knows that Marcus chose clearly when the time came to choose. He knows that the tending continued. He has said what he wanted to say to Marcus. I was not in the room for that conversation. It was theirs. What I know is that Marcus came out of the room looking the way a person looks when they have received something they did not know they were waiting for, and that James looked, for the rest of the evening, like a man who has set something down that he had been carrying for a long time. The estate is what it was. The house is in both names. The investments are what they are. The life insurance policy is current. James reviewed the documents from his chair in the living room with his reading glasses on and his attorney on the phone, and he said, everything looked reasonable, and he made a few small adjustments, and he signed what needed to be signed. Marcus's name is in the will, as it has always been, as it was always going to be. I want to say one more thing before I finish. People hear this story and they focus on the 7 years, on the exercises and the patience and the eventual outcome, and they say things like you are remarkable, and things like how did you do it, and what kept you going. I do not know how to answer that honestly without saying the obvious thing, which is that James is James. He is the person I chose when I was 25, and I have never had a reason to unchoose him. And a brain injury was not going to change that, because what I chose was not a version of James that depended on his being able to speak. One chose the person, and the person was still there. The 7 years were hard. I am not going to pretend they were not hard. There were mornings when I sat next to him and talked to him and did the exercises, and felt the particular weight of not knowing whether the tending was reaching anything. There were evenings when Marcus called and I could hear in his voice that he was going through something with Lacey, and I was in the middle of something with James, and I had to hold both of those things simultaneously, and neither of them had a resolution I could provide. There were moments of doubt, real ones, the kind where you ask yourself whether you are tending something that will grow, or whether you are just in the habit of tending. I kept going anyway, not because I was certain, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping felt like a betrayal of the person in the room with me, and I was not willing to betray James. That is the whole answer. I was not willing to betray James. Everything else is just the detail of how I kept that commitment over 7 years. He said my name in November, 2 syllables. The way he always said them. The detail was worth it. Every morning of it was worth it. My name is Dorothy Ellison. My husband's name is James. He is learning to walk again, and the garden is going to need tending in the spring, and we have a son named Marcus who chose correctly when the time came to choose. That is the whole story. That is everything. People ask me what the 7 years looked like on an ordinary Tuesday, and I think that question deserves an honest answer, because the extraordinary things that happened over that time grew out of the ordinary Tuesdays, and not the other way around. I woke up at 6:15 every morning. That had been my time before the accident, and I kept it because routine was the thing that held the days together, when the days did not have any other structure. I made coffee, I drank it, standing at the kitchen window, looking at the garden, because that was what I had always done, and I was going to keep doing it. At 7, I went to James. In the rehabilitation center, that meant a drive. At home, it meant walking down the hallway to the living room, where the hospital bed was set up near the window that faced east, because James had always preferred morning light. I said good morning to him the way I had said good morning to him for 38 years, not a clinical greeting. His name and a good morning, and then something about the day. What the weather was doing, what I had planned. Small, ordinary things that kept the day real. Then the exercises. 50 minutes every morning. Patricia had given me a sequence, and I followed it and I added to it as I learned what seemed to produce response and what did not. The biting came in the 3rd month. After that, it was part of the sequence every morning. His toes and his fingers, and the palms of his hands. Firm pressure and warmth and watching. I documented what I observed in a notebook. Every day, what I had done, and what he had done, and the quality of the response, if there was one. By the 7th year, I had 9 full notebooks. Patricia used to look at them during their sessions, and she said once that my documentation was more thorough than most clinical records she had seen. I said I had a lot of time and a lot of motivation. She said both of those things were evident. In the afternoons I worked. I had a job doing bookkeeping for 3 small businesses in Maplewood, which I had taken on in the 2nd year when the insurance ran out and the savings needed supplementing. I worked from home on the kitchen table, and I was good at it, and the business owners were understanding about my situation, and occasionally one of them would stop by with food, which I accepted because accepting help from people who want to give it is also something you have to learn. Marcus came every weekend in the first 2 years. Then his situation with Lacey began to require more of his attention, and the weekends became every other. And then once a month, and I understood this, and I did not make it harder. He called every Sunday without fail. We talked about James and about how he was and about his own life, and I listened carefully to the parts about Lacey because I was paying attention. The evenings were mine, after the exercises and the work and whatever the day had required. I sat in the living room with James and I read out loud, not to be therapeutic about it, because James had always liked being read to in the evenings. A habit we had developed years ago when he had a period of eye trouble and which had become simply what we did in the evenings. I read the books we had not gotten to, and the books we had read before that, I thought deserved rereading. I read him the local paper on Fridays. I read him the sports scores, even though he did not care much about sports because the normalcy of it seemed important. Some evenings I just talked. I told him about Marcus, about the garden, about the neighbors and the small events of a small town's life. I talked the way I had always talked to him, as to someone who would have opinions about what I was telling him and who I expected to share those opinions when the opportunity arose. I kept expecting that. It took 7 years. I kept expecting it anyway. I want to tell you about the notebooks specifically because they are the part of those 7 years that I am most grateful for and least expected. I started keeping them because Patricia asked me to. She said document what you observe, and I took that seriously in the way I take most things seriously, which is completely. The first notebook is the size of a standard composition book, and the handwriting in it is more careful than it became later, because I was still uncertain about what I was documenting and I wanted to get it right. By the 3rd notebook I had developed a shorthand, the date and the time, and then a series of coded observations. P for pressure response. W for warmth response, E for eye movement in response to stimulus, S for sound response, H for hand movement. Each one was followed by a description and a number from 1 to 10. That was my assessment of the quality of the response on that day. The numbers went up very slowly. They did not go up continuously. There were periods where they plateaued and periods where they went down, and I learned not to read too much into either direction over short periods. The trend over time was what I looked at. The trend over time was unmistakable. Patricia started waiting for the notebooks when she came for her weekly session. She would read the week's entries while I made her coffee, and she would ask questions about specific observations, and I would answer them. In the 4th year, she started bringing her own notebook to those sessions, and she started writing things down herself. In the 5th year, she mentioned the case at a conference and got questions she had not expected from her colleagues. I was not trying to contribute to medical knowledge. I was trying to keep my husband. But the 2 things turned out to be related, and I am not unhappy about that. The 9th notebook ends in November of the 7th year. The last entry is dated the Tuesday morning when James said my name. I wrote the entry that evening, after Marcus had come, and after the doctors had been called, and after James had been assessed, and after everything had happened that day. I sat at the kitchen table very late, and I wrote what had happened in the notebook the way I had written everything else. The date and the time, and then the observations. The last line in the notebook says, Jay said my name, said it was too long, said, are you all right? Said, I love you. Below that, I wrote the date and the time, and then I wrote, sufficient. That was all sufficient. That is what those 7 years produced, and sufficient is exactly the right word, because nothing about those 7 years was excessive. and nothing was insufficient, and sufficient is the word my father used to use for things that were exactly what they needed to be. Harold would have said sufficient. I closed the notebook. I went to bed. In the morning, I started a 10th one. Marcus knew more than I gave him credit for in those years. I understood this later, from conversations we had after James came back, from things Marcus said about what he had observed and what he had felt and what he had decided. He had known about Lacey longer than he admitted, not known specifically, known in the way that people know things they are not ready to fully understand. The feeling had been there for years, and he had been managing the feeling the way young people manage feelings they cannot afford to act on when the relationship is still providing something they need. What she provided was the feeling of being seen. That was what he told me. He said Lacey made him feel like the most interesting person in any room they were in, and that for a long time that had been the thing he needed most, and that he had not fully understood what it was costing him to have it. I asked him when he understood. He said gradually, and then all at once. He said it was like the moment in a math problem, when you realize you have been using the wrong formula the whole time, and all the answers you thought you had are wrong, and you have to go back to the beginning. I said that was an accurate description. He said he should have seen it sooner. I said he saw it when he was ready to see it, and that readiness could not be rushed, and that I had trusted him to get there, and he had. He looked at me for a moment. He said, I want you to know I paid attention while Dad was sick. He said, I watched you every day doing what you were doing, and I thought about it a lot. He said, I thought about what it meant that you just kept going. I said, what did you decide it meant? He said he decided it meant that love was not a feeling that came and went. He said he decided that love was what you kept doing when the feeling was not enough. He said, watching me with James for 7 years, had taught him to tell the difference between the people who would keep doing it and the people who would not. I said in Lacey, he said Lacey would not have kept doing it. I said no, I said I did not think she would. He said he was sorry it took him so long to see it. I said he was exactly on time. I have described what James came back to in terms of the people and the relationship, and the situation with the estate, and what had and had not been done to it. I have not described what he came back to in terms of the house itself, the physical fact of the home we had built over 38 years, because I think that belongs in this telling. The house is the same house. That is the first and most important thing we had discussed in the 3rd year. Whether the financial situation required selling it, and Patricia had helped me run the numbers. And the numbers said we could keep it if I was careful, and I was careful, and we kept it. The things in it are the things that were in it when James left. Not because I was preserving a museum, because they were good things that belonged where they were, and there was no reason to move them. His reading chair is in the same corner. His tools are in the garage in the organized way that he organized them. The photographs on the mantle are the photographs that were there, plus a few I added over the 7 years, including one of Marcus at his college graduation and one from the Thanksgiving 2 years. After the accident, where I had thought it was important to document that we were still celebrating, James noticed the photographs. He asked about them specifically. He asked me to tell him about each new one, and I told him, and he listened. And he held the one of Marcus at graduation for a long time. He said he missed it. I said I know. I said Marcus knows too. I said it was all right. He said he had thought about that day a lot. He said he had had a lot of time to think about specific things he had missed. I said what else? He said the last summer before the accident. He said we had talked about a trip, and we had never taken it. He said he had thought about that trip. I said we can still take it. He looked at me, he said you think so? I said James, you are talking to me. You are going to walk without the assistance by spring. You are going to eat my cooking at the kitchen table. I think we can get to a trip, he laughed. It was the first time I had heard him laugh in 7 years, and it was exactly the same laugh, the same quality, the same sound. 38 years of knowing that laugh, and it was unchanged. I sat next to him, and I held his hand, and we laughed together in the living room of the house that had waited for him, and I thought about the first day of the 7 years and what I had promised myself on that day, and how the promise had held. The house is the same house. James came home to it. The garden is waiting for spring. James asked about the climbing rose the first evening he was home. I told you that. What I have not told you is the story of the climbing rose, because the story belongs here. We planted it in the 2nd year of our marriage. Not because either of us had any particular knowledge of roses, because I had seen one climbing a fence in the neighborhood, and I had wanted one, and James had said let's put one in, and that was how. Most things got done in our life. Someone wanted something, and the other one said let's do it, and they did it. The rose struggled the first 2 years. I was inexperienced, and I made the mistakes that inexperienced gardeners make. Too much water, and then too little, and the wrong pruning at the wrong time. James had watched me struggle with it, and had not said anything, because he understood that learning required the struggle, and that offering to fix things the person needed to learn was not actually helpful. By the 3rd year, I had figured it out. The rose came in that spring, with more than it had given the previous 2 years combined, and it has been coming in every spring since. 36 years of springs. The canes are thick now, the kind of thick that takes decades. And in May, the thing is extraordinary, in the way that things that have been growing for a long time and have been consistently tended can be extraordinary. I did not let it go during the 7 years. I tended it the way I tended everything else. It was harder in the first year, because I did not have James's advice on the pruning, which had become his domain over the decades, and I made a small error that I corrected the following year. It came back fine. Things that have 30 years of root structure come back from small errors. When James asked about the rose on his first evening home, I said it was still there, and it had bloomed that summer. He said, "What color?" I said the same dark red it had always been. He said, "Good." He said he had been trying to remember the exact color, and he had not been able to get it quite right. I said, "You will see it in the spring." He said yes. He said he would. The spring is in 3 months. The rose is dormant now under the Tennessee winter, doing whatever roses do in dormancy, which is nothing visible but a great deal invisible. Building toward what it will be when the weather changes. James will see it. He will be walking by then, the doctors say, possibly without assistance. And he will come to the window and look at the back fence and see the rose that we planted in the 2nd year of our marriage doing what it has been doing for 36 years. I am looking forward to that morning. I have been looking forward to things again recently. It is a good feeling to have back. I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving because it was the first one with James present at the table in 7 years, and it deserves a specific description. Marcus came, he arrived the day before, and he helped me cook, which he had always done. And the kitchen was full of the smells of cooking in November, which are among the most reliably comforting smells there are. We made everything James liked. Sweet potato casserole, cornbread, the green beans the way his mother used to make them, which I had gotten the recipe for from his aunt years ago. James came to the table in the wheelchair for the first time. He was working toward walking, and he was not there yet, and we did not rush it. Marcus positioned the wheelchair, and James positioned himself in it, with the particular effort of someone who is relearning things and who takes each relearning seriously. He sat at the table, at his place, the place where he had always sat, at the end near the window. I had put his reading glasses there, even though he did not need them for dinner, because they were his and they belonged at his place and it seemed right. We said grace. I said it because James was still working on longer sentences, and the effort was real, and I did not want the effort to be part of grace. I said what I had always said, which was brief and specific, and not asking for things but giving thanks for what was present. I said I was grateful for the food and for the people at the table, and for November, and for perseverance. James said, "Amen." Just amen, but clearly in his voice. Marcus said, "Amen." He looked at his father and his father looked at him, and something passed between them that I did not try to interpret, because it was theirs. We ate. James ate slowly, and with effort, and with genuine pleasure. He said twice that the sweet potato casserole was good, and the second time he said it the way he had always said things he meant, directly and without embellishment. And I heard in those words 38 years of the same directness, and I said thank you James, and he nodded, and we went on eating. After dinner, Marcus and I did the dishes, and James sat at the table looking out the window at the dark garden. When we were done, Marcus brought his chair next to his father's, and they sat together. I went to my room to give them time. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I listened to the low sound of 2 voices in the kitchen. One strong, and one finding its way back. And I thought about the 7 years, and about the morning James said my name, and about the climbing rose and the notebooks, and Patricia and Marcus choosing correctly, and the prenuptial agreement that was never signed and the estate. That was exactly where it should be, and all of it added up to this. 2 people talking in a kitchen on Thanksgiving, everything in its right place. I went back to the kitchen. I made tea. We sat at the table together, all 3 of us, the way we had sat for all the years of Marcus's childhood. James and I on one side, and Marcus across from us. Outside the window, the November dark, and inside the kitchen, the warmth of the table, and the tea and the voices. My name is Dorothy Ellison. My husband's name is James. My son's name is Marcus. We had Thanksgiving together. That is the whole story. That is everything. I have not described the accident in detail because the accident is not the center of the story. The 7 years are the center. But I want to give it its proper place because it deserves to be named accurately. It was a March evening, a Tuesday, the kind of evening that does not announce itself as anything other than ordinary. James had been at a site visit in Nashville, and he was driving home on the state road that runs along the valley west of Maplewood. The road is 2 lanes, and it curves in the places where the valley curves. And in wet weather, the curves are more demanding than they look. The truck that came across the center line was driven by a young man who had been working since before dawn. He fell asleep at the wheel. He was not texting or drinking or doing anything other than being human in the way that humans are when they have been awake too long. He crossed the line on a curve and the vehicles met. James was struck on the driver's side. The door came in and the impact was to the right side of his skull, the temporal area specifically, and the result was what the doctors called a traumatic brain injury, with significant diffuse axonal damage. The skull fracture was repaired surgically. The brain itself healed what it could heal in the first months, and then the healing slowed to the pace of the nervous system, which is a very slow pace compared to the pace of the people waiting for it. The young man who drove the truck was not seriously injured. He came to the hospital the next day with his parents, and he stood in the waiting room and he cried. I went to speak with him. I want to tell you about that conversation because it belongs in this telling. He was 23 years old. He was a construction worker. He had been working long days because they were behind on a project. He had fallen asleep, and he had done this terrible thing, and he was standing in a hospital waiting room crying, and he did not know what to say to me. I told him that I understood he had not intended this. I told him that accidents were called accidents for a reason. I told him that I wanted him to go home and sleep and eat, and take care of himself, because James would not have wanted him to be destroyed by something he had not intended. He said he did not know how to live with it. I said, you live with it by living. I said, you wake up in the morning and you do the work that comes to hand, and you try to do good in the world and you don't stop. I said that is the only thing I know how to tell you. He nodded. He went home with his parents. I went back to the waiting room. I thought about that conversation many times over the 7 years, about what I had said to him. Wake up and do the work that comes to hand and don't stop. I said it to him, and then I went home and I did it myself every day for 7 years. And I can confirm that the advice was sound. You wake up, you do the work, you don't stop. That is the whole instruction for the impossible thing. It is not complicated, it is only hard. I want to say more about Patricia because she is part of this story and she deserves the full account of her part in it. Patricia Warren had been a physical therapist for 22 years when she was assigned to James. She was the best in her facility, which is not a modest assessment, but also not an exaggeration. And she had the specific gift of people in her profession who combined genuine expertise with the ability to be honest without cruelty. She did not tell me things were going to be fine when she did not know if they were going to be fine. She did not refuse to give me information because she was worried I could not handle it. She treated me as a person capable of understanding reality. Her skepticism about the biting was professional and legitimate. She had seen many family members develop rituals around their loved ones that they invested with more significance than the evidence warranted. She had watched hope become a form of misreading. She was careful because she had seen what happened when expectations were miscalibrated and the reality arrived to contradict them. She told me this. Not as a dismissal, as an explanation of her caution. She said, I want you to understand why I am being careful here, so that my caution does not feel like a refusal to believe you. I said, I appreciated that. I said I was not asking her to believe me. I said I was asking her to watch what I was watching, and see what she saw. She watched over 5 years. She watched at the end of the 5th year. She told me she had revised her assessment of what was happening in the case. She said the pattern of response was too consistent and too specific to be reliably attributed to reflex. She said she did not have a clear mechanism to explain it. She said she was going to write about it. She did write about it, in a journal that her colleagues read. She wrote carefully, and with the appropriate hedging of someone who is reporting something they do not fully understand. The response from her colleagues was, she told me, more interested than she had expected. There were other practitioners who had observed similar things and had not known what to do with what they had observed. I was not thinking about journals or colleagues. I was thinking about the 10 o'clock response on a Tuesday, and whether it was stronger than the previous Tuesday, and what that might mean. I was thinking about James. Patricia came to the hospital the morning James spoke. I had called her before I called Marcus. She arrived in 30 minutes and she sat with James and she talked to him and he responded and she sat back and she looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked at me. She said, "You were right." I said, "I know." I said I was right from the beginning. She said yes. She said she was sorry it took her longer to see it. I said she had been watching carefully for 5 years. I said that was not nothing. I said, I would rather have had a careful skeptic watching than an enthusiastic believer who was not paying attention. She laughed. She said that was a generous way to put it. I said it was the accurate way. I have mentioned the estate, and I want to close the account of it properly because the story deserves a complete ending. James came back to a financial situation that was different from the one he had left, but not catastrophically so. The savings had been reduced by 7 years of expenses that required covering without his income. The house was intact. The investment in the engineering firm, which had continued to perform during his absence, because the firm was well run and did not require James's daily presence to function, had actually grown. His partnership stake had been maintained by the other partners at Patricia's encouragement. Because the partnership agreement allowed for medical leave of undefined duration, and the value of that stake had compounded in his absence. He sat with his attorney and with the accountant, and he reviewed everything carefully. He said the situation was not what he had expected in either direction, neither as good as he would have hoped, nor as bad as he had feared. He said what was apparent was that Dorothy had been very careful. The attorney said yes. The attorney said very careful was an understatement. James said he was not surprised by that. Marcus was informed about the estate in full. Not to create obligation or pressure, because James believed that being in a family meant knowing the relevant facts about the family's situation. Marcus received the information the way he received most things. Quietly and thoughtfully, and he asked a few specific questions, and he said he was grateful for the transparency. Lacey had been gone for 3 years by this point. The prenuptial agreement that had contained the concerning clause had never been signed. Whatever she had been positioning for had not been positioned for successfully. The estate is what it is. The house is in both names. Marcus is in the will. James is at the kitchen table. The garden is going to need tending in the spring. Everything is as it should be. Nothing more complicated than that. Maplewood is the kind of town where people know each other's business, whether they intend to or not, and where significant events tend to travel through the community at the speed of conversation. James's accident had been significant. His 7 years had been observed, from the outside, with a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty that communities extend to situations they do not know how to help with. People had brought food in the early years and had asked about him and had quietly stopped asking after a while, because the asking felt hollow when the situation was not changing. When James spoke, the word went around the way words go around in small towns, which is to say completely and quickly. I received calls from people I had not spoken to in 3 or 4 years. The woman from the church who had organized a meal train in the first months called to say she was so glad. The man who had worked at the hardware store under James's father, and who was in his 80s, now called and cried on the phone, and I let him cry, and I told him James would want to see him when he was ready for visitors. The young doctor, who had taken over the local practice in the 4th year end, who had managed James's ongoing care, came to the house personally. When he heard, he sat with James, and he did his assessment, and he said things were better than his notes had predicted. He looked at the notebooks afterward, and he said he thought the notes should be shared. I said I would discuss it with Patricia. Maplewood had watched this story from the outside for 7 years, and now it had an ending it had not expected, and it received the ending with the particular warmth of a community that is glad to have been wrong about what was possible. I am not sentimental about community in the way that people expect women of my age to be, but there is something real in the fact of being known by the people around you and having them care about the outcome of your life. It is not nothing. When James gets strong enough to walk to the hardware store building that used to be his father's, the people who know him will stop and say hello. That matters. I do not pretend it does not matter. James's first public outing was a Saturday in December, before Christmas. Marcus pushed the wheelchair, and James wore his good coat, and we went to the diner on the main street that had been the diner on the main street since before any of us were born. We ordered coffee, and James ordered the pie he had always ordered. Apple with a scoop of vanilla that was never quite enough vanilla, and we sat in the booth in the corner and we drank our coffee. 3 people stopped to say hello. Not in a performance, in the way of people who are genuinely glad to see someone who had been absent. James said hello to each of them, and they were careful not to make a fuss, even though you could see that a fuss was exactly what they felt like making. He appreciated that. He always had appreciated people who felt the appropriate thing without requiring it to be theatrical. We drove home afterward through the December streets of Maplewood, and I looked at the windows of the houses lit from the inside and the Christmas lights and the ordinary life of an ordinary town doing what it does in December, and I thought about how much I had missed this. The ordinary, the driving home, the James in the passenger seat. He said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I am thinking it is good to be driving home." He said yes, he said it was. We drove home, we made dinner. We ate at the kitchen table. That is the whole story, that is everything, that is all of it. My name is Dorothy Ellison, my husband's name is James. He said my name on a Tuesday morning in November, after 7 years. The first thing he said after my name was that he loved me. I knew that. I had always known that. I kept tending things anyway. The garden is going to need tending in the spring. I will be there. James's first full sentence was not my name. My name was the first word. The first full sentence came 3 days later on a Friday morning. I was doing the exercises, his left hand, the pressure sequence. I had been doing it for 7 years, and I was doing it the way I had always done it, with full attention and without hurry. When he said he was sorry, I stopped. I looked at him. He said he was sorry it had taken so long. He said that slowly, with effort, in the careful way of someone choosing each word before placing it. He said he had been trying to say it for a while. He said he was not sure if a while meant days or weeks or longer. I said there was nothing to be sorry for. He said there was. He said the 7 years were his to be sorry for, even though they had not been his fault. I thought about that for a moment. I understood what he meant. The 7 years had cost me something, and he knew that, and knowing it made the 7 years something he wanted to apologize for, even though the accident that caused them had been nobody's fault, and the years themselves had been spent by me in the doing of what I had committed to doing. I said, "James," I said, "listen to me." I said the 7 years were not something that happened to me. I said they were something I chose. I said every morning I got up and I chose to tend things, and I would choose it again every morning of those 7 years without changing a single day. I said you do not owe me an apology for that. You owe me nothing for that. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said you were always better at this than I was. I said, better at what? He said better at knowing what things were actually worth. He said, I always wanted to make everything fair, and you always understood that fairness was the wrong frame. He said you understood that you just do the thing that needs doing, and fairness is not the point. I said Harold taught me that. He said your father was a wise man. I said yes. I said he was. We sat together in the morning light, and I held his hand and we did not say anything for a while. That was also something we had always been good at, the two of us. Sitting together in silence, that is not empty but full. Full of everything that has been said and everything that does not need to be said because it is already understood. 7 years of exercises and notebooks and documenting and Patricia's skepticism and Lacey's folders and Marcus's clarity and the climbing rose and the garden and the soup I made on Sundays and the books I read out loud in the evenings and the sound of rain on the house at night and all the ordinary, extraordinary days of 7 years of not stopping. All of it. Sitting together in the morning light. My name is Dorothy Ellison. My husband's name is James. He said he was sorry, and I told him there was nothing to be sorry for, and I meant it completely. That is the whole story. That is everything.